So I've been really excited about this because these wonderful people have been working for a really long time on this book, and a lot of other Georgia Tech faculty members. There's been a massive amount of work that went into this, amazing research, and so thank you to everyone who's here. Before we get started, I'm going to do a little intro. I think most of you know our panelists, so I'll keep it short, but Rob, Ashok, Lauren. So Rob is a former C21U employee, and he's now at Strada, the Strada Institute for the Future of Work, and he's a senior research fellow there. Ashok is a professor of computer science and cognitive science in the School of Interactive Computing. And Lauren, also former C21U, is an assistant professor in the Department of Learning Sciences at Georgia State. And so before we get going, I think we were going to have Ashok just share a little bit about the making of this book and talk about that just a little bit.
Sounds very good. Thank you, Brittany. So I want to talk about two things: the origins of the book and its goals, as well as thanks to some people who have been instrumental in the production of the book. So first about the origins. The origins of the book really lie in some discussions at C21U. This was soon after the founding of C21U, where various faculty would informally say, we know about blended learning, we want to do it in our classes, but we either don't have the resources to do it right, or we don't quite know how to do it. So that led to lots of discussions, C21U, and I know that Rich talked to Amanda Madden, who is one of the, in fact, the lead editor of the volume, and he talked to me, and then the three of us met in this conference room on the other side of the hallway and shook hands and agreed that we will do this book. So that's sort of the origin of that book. At that time, there were three goals to the project. The first goal was just compile all the things as many things about blended learning going on at Georgia Tech into one volume to highlight those efforts. Second, to provide descriptive accounts of the various efforts. And third, to perhaps abstract out some prescriptive methodology that all faculty at Georgia Tech, or many faculty at Georgia Tech, could use. So as we started doing that, as we started campaigning to learn about who all was doing blended learning at Georgia Tech, a new opportunity arose. We found that many of the people who were doing blended learning in practice were also doing research in blended learning. So they would do assessments, and they would do iterative cycles about it, and that put forward another opportunity, thinking not just about practice, but how to do research in blended learning. So Lauren and Robert were instrumental there. They have written two really good chapters in the volume, where they talk about enough about research methods to be able to get started on doing research in blended learning. So the literature in blended learning is vast and rapidly growing, but most of it is written by education researchers, for education researchers, and is inaccessible to simple people like me. But I think what Robert and Lauren have done is to write that part about education research so that people working in individual disciplines can also get it. So that much about the origins and history and goals of the volume. Now some acknowledgements. I already mentioned Rich and C21U, and Rich has been part of this project from the beginning, and I would say that the idea of the book belongs as much to him as to anyone else. And C21U really has supported this book in many ways, providing access to Brittany's services, for example, in more ways than one, supporting Robert and Amanda partially or to work on the book, and Rich also wrote the foreword for the book. So if you will join me, can we give him and C21U a round of applause, please? There also are, of course, acknowledgement to all the authors of the various chapters. As one of the authors remarked to me just last week, he said that he is used to writing lots of papers and chapters, and he's of course brilliant at doing that. He's not used to preparing chapters for a volume where the authors have to go through 6 rounds of revisions. But the authors all stuck with us. The project has been going on for about 3.5 years. I think the meeting with Rich was in fall of 2015, if I remember it correctly. And lots of these chapters have gone through lots of revisions. But the authors have, I think, done an excellent job. So thank you to all of them. And thank you also to Brittany, not only for moderating this, but for supporting us in marketing and publicity in more ways than one all throughout. Back to you.
So now we're going to have Rob share a little bit about the making of the book. But before that, I do want to acknowledge, like Ashok said, that one of the key editors wasn't able to be here today, Amanda Madden, and that we're very grateful for her and sad she couldn't be with us today. But yeah, Rob, if you could just share a little bit about the process. I know many drafts were mentioned, and I think everyone here would be interested to hear a little bit about what that involved.
Sure. The process was really Amanda's to guide, and we're really grateful to her for bringing that process together. But it started with a sort of call out to folks who were doing blended learning around campus and saying, if you're interested, we'd love to know if you have a chapter that you would like to submit. And the book, we'll get into this more a little later, but the book basically has two different frames through which you can look at blended learning. On the one hand, there is the research side of it. How do you gather data and how do you evaluate whether or not your blended learning class is being successful? And on the other hand, there is the sort of practical side. How do you do blended learning? What are the different options available to you and so forth? So we were looking for chapters that were very much along those lines in both of those perspectives. And as we went through the process, we ended up with, do we have 14 chapters? Is that right? 14 chapters that, from various faculty across several different colleges within Georgia Tech that really tell very rich and detailed stories. So we were very grateful to get those submissions from those different faculty members. We have thanks to Rich, we have some connections at MIT Press. They were willing to look at a proposal for the book. They went through it. They liked the idea. They said, go ahead and send us a draft. And we sent the draft in fall of 2016, I think it was, something like that. And they had a couple of experts in the field go through the draft, gave us very useful feedback on what could be improved, what could be modified, what else needed to be included, and so forth. And then we went through another round of revisions with the chapter authors. So this whole process kind of rolled out slowly over 2017, where we were getting revisions back from the authors, sending them into MIT. Then we had to go through graphics and if you have charts, we need to have them in this kind of format. And if you have tables, we need to know that they're going to be double spaced and they're going to be in this font. So a lot of it gets very technical with the MIT folks in terms of how they're going to do the layout for all of this. And then finally, towards the end of 2017 into 2018, we had pretty much a full working draft of the manuscript, and we set into the print process from there. And that took most of 2018. Actually, was just the printing and reformatting. So
this was the result. If you haven't seen the actual book, Barnes & Noble should be setting up a table if you want to check them out afterwards outside. But yes, it's quite a lot of work that went into this physical copy that's here with us.
Yes, for sure. And I think it's worth pointing out a second time that the book, I think, is very rich from the perspective of the contributions from all the authors. It's not just a computer science blended learning book. It's not just a physical sciences or a communications blended learning book. We have people from School of Public Affairs, people from, I think, all but one college are represented in the book. And so that's a real triumph for us that we can demonstrate not only to the Georgia Tech community, but also to the broader community at large, that Georgia Tech is able to bring together a lot of differing perspectives on a different way of teaching and show that we have this real cohesion at Georgia Tech in that.
Yeah, and so that actually sort of leads us into some of the questions we were going to discuss. But one thing that I would love to hear your thoughts on as well, you're the Georgia State contributor to this. I would love to hear a little bit about your experience of the collaborative nature of this, the sheer number of people involved, you being not at Georgia Tech and contributing to this, and what sort of precedent this might set for collaboration moving forward, and how faculty across universities like in USG can produce work like this.
Sure.
I feel like I would love to hear that from you.
Yeah, and I would even say that my part in this wasn't as big as Amanda's part in sort of creating that collaborative nature. So Amanda, having a PhD in history, she really gets how to write books and write book chapters, as well as she has that educational perspective. So, Ashok's talking about going through iterations and iterations and iterations of these chapters. It's because most of the contributors who actually wrote chapters don't have a background in writing about education or educational research or how to design a class. And so that's where a lot of it came from, is having people from 5 different colleges with very rich and diverse perspectives create something that's a little bit cohesive. And so that was a big part of the collaboration nature around this. And I know that I at Georgia State, being a Georgia Tech graduate, and Steve Harmon being from Georgia State, we actually switched spots. As I was graduating, he was coming here. We're very much interested in those sort of cross-collaboration and cross-institutional collaborations. And I will say that I live about 3 blocks from here in Midtown, so that helps a lot. Whenever we wanted to call a meeting, we could I could just come on my way home or something like that. But I mean, there's no reason not to. Our universities are only 2 miles away. Y'all don't have a school of education. Georgia State has one. We don't have a college of engineering, because why would we? Georgia Tech is 2 miles down the road. Why would we want to put forward that effort? But to sort of tie it back in, if any of you are interested in education research and picking up sort of where this book leaves off, I know there are a lot of collaborators at Georgia State, if you're needing someone with that education expertise and background, that are interested in working with people.
Yeah, that's great. So I guess backtracking a little bit, I would love to hear from each of you sort of your own thoughts and ideas that prompted your involvement in this, sort of taking your background a little bit and talking about your input into this and how you got to this point of feeling like you wanted to produce a book on blended learning.
Sure. And so we each came in at different times. So I'll let Ashok take it first, since he was the first one involved.
Thanks, Lauren. So I began as part of the OMSCS program, starting thinking about blended learning, and David Joyner is here. David and I, in 2014, started a OMSCS class on knowledge-based AI, which turned out to be a fairly popular class. We prepared lots of educational materials for that, and a rough estimate is that David and I put in about 1,000 hours of work in it. And I have to say that David did most of the work. So out of those 1,000 hours, 800 or 750 belonged to him. I did relatively little. But having invested that much time and effort into it, we wanted to reuse those educational materials. So the following year, starting in fall 2015, I started thinking about the residential class on knowledge-based AI in terms of blended learning, so that the students will have access to the online materials in advance. They will look at them, read them, and in the class we will do active learning. I'm going to just add just a little bit more, because I want to share something that happened last year. We found very quickly that the students in the residential classes and the online classes were doing as well on the learning assessments as each other. So normally we think that the online students may not do as well, but that was not the case for this particular class. Significant amount of evidence suggests that same class, same structure, same syllabus, same everything, same learning assessments, and the students in the 2 classes did equally well. But then there was a concern that was raised. Maybe the online students are doing so well because they are more mature, older. The median age there is about 38. So last year we went to the provost and requested him to give us the authority to offer a online section of the knowledge-based AI class for residential students. So last fall, for the first time, we ran the knowledge-based class, 2 sections, one online, one residential, both for residential students. So now the student demographics in the two sections were exactly the same. So we find no statistical differences. And again, we compared the results in terms of as measured by the learning assessments. Now, admittedly, these are results measured only by learning assessments, not other kinds of learning. And again, we found that there was no difference in terms of learning outcomes for the online class and the residential class using the materials. So that was an exciting development for us. That creates all kinds of questions that I'll come to later, but that's how I got started.
I was the next to join, so I'll go next. So Amanda and Ashok came to me and said, it was right after I'd stopped being a research assistant at C21U because I wanted to practice teaching before I became a professor. Crazy idea, I know. But they came to me and they said, you've been working on blended learning. There's a taxonomy that I developed while I was working at C21U that is sort of woven throughout this book to help sort of create that common thread between all the different types of blended learning that are represented in the book. And so they came to me and said, you've done a lot of work in this area. We're interested in using your taxonomy to create this common thread in the book. And would I be an editor? And so that's how I got involved, was sort of being C21U's old blended learning person, and continuing on having done a lot of work with the people who wrote the chapters in the book while I was at C21U. And also my PhD is in psychology, and so a lot of, as Ashok was mentioning, research methods is sort of what I get excited about in the morning because I'm a weird person like that. So that was a big reason that I got involved in the book, was for that research component as well as the blended learning from a sort of literature perspective.
And for everyone that's watching at home, when we post the recording for this, I'll also share a link to Lauren's account so that you can take a look at that and her great work she did while she was in.
So I was the last to join the team, and before I came to Georgia Tech a few years back, I had been wearing two hats. I was teaching for the University of Colorado, Denver, as an adjunct faculty member in sociology, which is my field, and I was doing a lot of blended learning work when I was there. My day job during that time was for an educational research company, and I was doing a lot of statistical analyses of educational data and things like that. So when I came to Georgia Tech and Amanda and I started meeting and talking about projects and things, she said, what about marrying the two and doing educational research on blended learning? And I said, well, don't you already have somebody doing that? And I think the general consensus was there was still a lot of work to do on the book, and it would be nice to split it up with a fourth person. So fortunately, I was graciously welcomed in by the rest of the members of the team, and that's how I joined in.
To sort of jump off of that, talking about there being so much to do and still so much research in this area that can be done, could you talk a little bit about your key takeaways from this, things that were new or really stand out from the research that is compiled in the book, and then kind of how that will lead us into the future of blended learning?
I will say that before I became involved in this project, I had a much more limited understanding of what blended learning was. And so mostly, and I think for a lot of people, when you hear the term blended learning, you might think of the flipped classroom, which is one type of blended learning. A flipped classroom is where essentially the lectures are delivered by video, some kind of technology, to the students outside of class, and then when the students come inside the class, they do the homework, quote unquote. They work on projects together. And that's one type of blended learning, but that was pretty much all that I was aware of. So one of the biggest takeaways for me was learning how many different ways there are to blend technology into instruction and to get students involved in multiple different ways of project-based learning and problem-based learning and group work and collaboration with things like Amanda's chapter in the volume, which is about teaching history and writing through using the game Assassin's Creed 2. So teaching students by using a video game about the Italian Renaissance, which was intricately detailed in this video game. And I thought, that's really creative. You know, who does that? Who teaches through a video game? And so that is just one example of how my perspective on blended learning expanded through the book.
Nope, build on that.
Okay.
So I have my book open here because I didn't want to forget all of the different sort of themes that we identified through doing this work. And so in the conclusion, we have a common themes area. And so building on all the different ways that there are to blend and to integrate technology into the classroom, the sort of takeaway that I had, which is different than when I first entered this space thinking about blended learning, flipped classrooms, I thought, you know, most people just use this as a way to improve learning outcomes. That's the only goal that they have when they think about flipping their class. That's all they want to do. But really, there's a lot of different goals that you can achieve with blended learning. And so we have several chapters towards each of these different goals, including increasing the quality and consistency of instruction across courses that are big and have multiple sections and maybe have grad student teaching assistants who rotate through every year and don't really ever have a time to get settled. So that's one contribution that blended, or one goal that blended learning can achieve. Increasing the scale of classes. If you need to go to 1,000-person intro to computer science class and you want to, you know, maintain the top standards of a David Joyner, then you can use blended learning to reach all of those people, as well as increasing the learning outcomes. If you're really focusing on practical, application-based learning and you want, say, in engineering, your students to come out with a good understanding of how to apply the things that they're learning, blended learning can help. And then the last one is for online education. So if you're needing to, for space, like physical space reasons or whatever other reasons, needing to do some sort of online component, you can use blended learning to add that online component as well as put a little bit of the face-to-face face-to-face component in there to really boost the contribution of that online component.
Thank you. I think I have two takeaway lessons. The first is when I talk with my faculty colleagues here at C21U or in my School of Interactive Computing, some of them raise objections. And I want to go through those objections because this book, it's various chapters in the book try to address those objections. One objection is blended learning works for small classes, not for large classes. Well, there are a couple of chapters, one by David Joyner, the other by Bonnie Ferry and her colleagues, which address exactly that problem. Another one is it works for disciplines, but not for cross-disciplines. There is a chapter by Lauren herself in which psychology and computing students were working together. There is objections like, well, it works for a given culture, not for multiple cultures. There is a chapter by Joe Bankoff and Ken Crosspool about exactly where there were populations, some in France, some here, working together and using blended learning. One other objection is, well, blended learning can work for some activities, but not for projects. There is a chapter by Mark Braunstein and colleagues which talks about how he was using blended learning in a class on health informatics, while the projects were really about clinical decision-making where students were working with various kinds of clinical physicians. It's not that blended learning is necessarily the right answer for every situation, but I think some of the common objections that are given to blended learning perhaps need more scrutiny. This book gives some evidence that maybe those objections are not as valid as sometimes they are made out to be. The second takeaway lesson is from a technology perspective. When we think about blended learning, we often think that there is a technology which is, we build some technology, some online educational materials, but all the active learning occurs in the classroom, face-to-face. But now there are tools available, so the technology itself can enable active learning. Active learning is no longer the province of face-to-face classroom. So as an example, the class that David Joyner and I built there are about 18 hours of video lessons, and there are about 150 exercises buried in those video lessons. And students are given problems, and students give answers to them, and then there's a tutor that gives feedback. Students can struggle for quite a bit of time. Now, admittedly, this is still instructor-driven, not student-driven, but there is a degree of which students are actually participating in the learning activities and not just passively listening to some material. So in that sense, this goes a little bit beyond just the passive use of technology. So I think now there is technologies available that open new vistas about how to think about blended learning and not just simply passive technology, active classrooms.
I think to kind of, my last question has to do with what you just said. It opens up new opportunities. I would love to hear each of you speak a little bit to the future of blended learning, knowing all of this, spending many years with all the content in this book, in C21U and with the Commission on Creating the Next in Education, we're always talking about the future. And so if you could talk about the future, what you see or predict with blended learning, that would be great.
That's an easy question, Lauren.
Well, and so my question might not be representative of the other editors because, you know, I worked at C21U and did all this work on blended learning before I ever taught myself. So I've never known anything else. I've always used a blended model for my classes. People talk about preparing their slides and going through their presentation almost in preparation for class, and I'm like, that sounds boring. And so, you know, I've always used the model in class, and it's not a big thing to me. I don't make videos for the students. I carefully select readings. I give them before they go to the reading, I give them sort of a breakdown in the previous class of here's what to look for, pay attention to these things, answer these questions, actually answer them, send them to me. They do an activity that I look through before we ever get into class, so that we can do sort of a targeted, here's what you didn't quite understand or what you had questions about before we just go straight into the activities. So, you know, compared to Ashok's class, which has a lot of production value behind it, I just sort of use almost a return to the traditional you should read before you come to class model. And it works because I stick to it. I don't end up lecturing when people haven't read. I say, well, if you're not prepared, then, you know, you can go read now. That would be a good use of your time. So I've always done that blended learning model. And I think especially for the way that college, sort of the trends in college towards providing practical experiences, preparing for internships, preparing for jobs, that's been a real value to my students, especially because most of my students are master's or PhD students, so they're thinking very applied already, is that they're able to come up with a project by the end of all of my classes that they can put in a portfolio and show a prospective employer, that they actually know what these things mean in practice. It helps talk through, well, theoretically, this is what we know about this space, but in practice, here's all the things that you're gonna run into. So I teach like an instructional design class that ideally this is how we would design a class, but in practice, you're not gonna have time for all of that. And so it helps talk through those practical applications. And so I think whether you call it blended or not, or whether it's truly blended or not, the future of blended learning or sort of college education in general is towards this more practical, applied, activity-driven classroom. And that helps me understand what the students know and what they don't know and where they need the most help. So again, I've never known anything different, but I always get really good student evaluations at the end of the year. So maybe that's some sort of indication.
One of the things that I see coming is going to be this explosion of technology that will be included in blended learning going forward. There's a great interest, one of my great interests is in augmented and virtual reality that could be incorporated into blended learning environments. This technology as many times as it has kind of had a stop and start a level of excitement, is going to become more ubiquitous going forward. 5G is going to allow greater data streaming. Wi-Fi 6 is going to allow you to have faster Wi-Fi in your home for streaming virtual reality content into a smartphone that could be gesture-based. That LG, in fact, just released a new smartphone that incorporates hand gestures for how you interact with the phone. So think about a student who's not just watching a video lecture from their dorm room about fluid mechanics, but they're actually putting their smartphone into a Google Cardboard type of headgear, and taking apart a digital hydraulic piston as they're doing their homework. And then they come into class with the professor, and the professor says, okay, now we're actually going to take a look at how that works with a real hydraulic piston. So I see that one of the futures for blended learning is going to be an increased level of interactivity with the content that the students are going to be learning and then applying when they get into the classroom.
Thank you. That's a really hard question. So thanks to Lauren and Robert for giving me the time to collect my thoughts. If we look at almost every sphere of education, technology is changing it radically and rapidly. We know about the libraries, for example. Most of the libraries, well, growing up in India, my father was a professor of physics, so I had access to this university library, huge libraries with millions of books. All of those libraries are now becoming digital libraries. But there is one aspect of education which has resisted technology, and that's the classroom. For some reason, professors think that they are the kings and the queens of the classroom. It's their classroom. They will do exactly the way they learned to do from their professors a generation back. But I think technology is coming in the classroom. Technology is there. Why not take advantage of it? And if you're going to take advantage of technology, then blended learning is clearly one way of going about doing it. So my sense is the time has come to embrace blended learning openly. There is a lot about blended learning we don't know. So there is a lot more empirical work that needs to be done to get it right. We don't know how to do it right, exactly the way it should be done. But clearly the momentum is there, and we want to embrace it rather than resist it.
That's great. So I think now we'll open it up for questions and discussion. Did any of you have any final thoughts you wanted to share about the book before we do that?
I wondered whether the authors of the various chapters here would like to share a little bit about their specific chapters, because they probably have takeaways that we may not have captured well. David?
Hi, I'm David Joyner. I wrote one of the chapters for the book. I teach our online CS1 class. There are a lot of takeaways from the class, but I think the main takeaway, and this is kind of more of an online learning takeaway, but I think it applies to blended learning as well, especially as blended learning can be used in conjunction with online learning, is that online learning gets thrown around a lot as if it's this static thing, that online learning is a thing, people do online learning, and it's just, it's there, and there's not much variation within it. And there have been plenty of studies that have shown that online outcomes are inferior to in-person outcomes. And as Ashok mentioned in the class we created, we saw online students doing just as well. In my online undergraduate class, same kind of thing, we still see online students doing just as well. And so I think the main takeaway, and it's kind of an obvious takeaway in retrospect, so in some way it's more of a caution, is that when you think about online learning, you can have good online teachers, you can have bad online teachers, you can have good online classes, bad online classes. A lot is to be said about the particular execution in the medium. Not just about the people, but also about the situation that the course is developed in. I've talked to online teachers, and their university's general approach is they found out 2 weeks before a semester started, my class is going to be online this semester. That's not a situation in which you're really put in a place where you have a great chance of success. When you look at the classes that we've developed, the things that we've done, the big emphasis has been on putting a lot of resources in at the start to do it really, really, really well once, and then reap those benefits over time. I do think the same thing applies to blended learning, though. which is that whenever we're designing classes, we kind of emphasize the things that you, in theory, can carry over and revise and tweak from semester to semester, and those things that you can only do once the semester actually starts. And drawing a clear delineation of what I can reuse and revise and modify and benefit from already having prepared really puts you in a position to succeed in these. So every semester you're not reinventing the wheel and kind of doing it more as an improv performance every semester. That's hard to do because we're all busy people, and this requires some advanced attention, but it really pays off down the line. So I guess that's two takeaways. One is that not all online learning is created alike, and a little bit of preparation makes up for a lot of fly by the seat of your pants. So.
Hi, I'm Joe Bankoff, and with Ken Knespo, contributed the chapter that's at the end of the book on our class on global issues and leadership. I have a slightly different perspective on this, and I need to give you the full disclosure that I'm the fake academic in the room. I'm actually a recovering lawyer, but I spent about 30 years leading an organization called the National Institute for Trial Advocacy, which seeks to teach trial lawyers how to try cases and not embarrass themselves. And it is not an academic or a lecture process, it's get on your feet and do it. So I'm a great believer in muscle memory as it relates to a lot of these things. And I will tell you that my observation, in fact, the class itself, started when my colleague who runs Sciences Po's School of International Affairs and I were giving a panel discussion, I think in Geneva several years ago, at the time when all of a sudden there was this explosion in online learning, and I think we may not yet have launched the master's class, but we were close to it. And we were asked, well, how does this play for things like international affairs and public policy? And Vanessa Shear and I took the view that while, for example, I had watched videos streamed from an airplane from Purdue when I was in high school, that online was not novel. The ability to be interactive was a new improvement, but frankly depended on what you were trying to teach. And the view was that if you were trying to teach something in which there's one right answer, it's numeric, it's in the back of the book, and it's cheating to work with anybody else, then this kind of instruction works pretty well. And we'd seen this with Khan Academy and a lot of other things. If you're dealing with issues in which there is no right answer, there may be a series of less bad right answers or wrong answers, then you need to have something that allows a more interactive opportunity. And secondly, we were really looking at how you build continuous learners and to become much more aware of the fact you learn actively from the other students in your group. Now, I confess that I think I'm not throwing the classroom out the window, but not a hell of a lot of learning goes on in evenly spaced rows and lecture halls in 50-minute increments, all right? And most of the impact that a lot of students feel is with their colleagues, but if they're all homogeneous, you're not really getting the experience of how do you learn in a diverse environment, and how do you take account of the fact there are different personalities, there are different cultures, there's different beliefs, there's different ways of making decisions. And so we took on the notion of creating a deliberately diverse class and giving everybody 3 weeks to get ready to brief Senator Nunn on some global issue. And then 3 weeks later, Admiral Winnefeld, and then Dennis Lockhart, the former president of the Federal Reserve Bank. And apart from scaring them to death, the point was we did not expect them to become experts in the topic that we picked, although they were very interested in the topic. The premise was they were going to explain to Senator Nunn, as though he were going into a National Security Council meeting, what the hell is the problem? Because the objective was to have this perspective melange come to a view of what's the problem, what's driving it, who are the actors, and you only do that by pushing their nose into it. So they were in rotating teams. They didn't sit with the same team all 3 exercises. It was not a semester-long thing. So to come to the point here, depends on what you're trying to teach, how you best use these tools. It also means that you must be aware that we're looking at generational differences. To this crowd of students, virtual is real. after about 5 minutes. And the reason I think we're seeing a improvement in what we are measuring as outcomes in what we would call distance learning and a generation ago is exactly that reason, that they're used to it. Now the problem is they're used to writing in 128 characters. So that becomes another challenge about how you deal with that. And so we have peer grading of weekly blogs in order to spin it out so that they have to say something about something they care about in their own voice. So to Ashok's point, we now have a range of tools where technology can be a helpmate. The trick is not getting hypnotized by the tools because they're not self-executing and you can overdo it. So you have to adjust for what you're trying to get out of it. But in our terms, what we found was it was extraordinarily effective in building a sense of real team and real participation. We were in class 4 days after the bombs went off in Paris in areas very close to where our French students live. And there was real PTSD among my own students here until they did a nose count, make sure everybody was okay. So as I say, to this generation, virtual is real.
Thank you. Are there any other authors that want to share? All right, well, we can open it up for discussion now or questions. Did anyone have any questions about any of our topics earlier or for the authors that just shared? Rich?
So, Lauren, I was struck by your story about blended learning. When we started the center, we did a focus group with high school students, and we brought them in and we told them about all the great things Georgia Tech was going to do with flipped classrooms and blended learning. And there was a segment of the class, these were middle school kids, there was a segment of the class that looked at us like we were from Mars, because they had only been in blended classroom. So it's like, we brought them to Georgia Tech to show them the future. They had been living in the future their entire academic life. So what do you see in that category now? So when you think about the topics that you folks have talked about in the book and today, are we sort of underestimating what's happening in K through 12?
Great point, because being in a college of education now, I see the disjoint between K through 12 and higher education. And it's exactly like you said. In higher education, instructors have academic freedom. We can do whatever we want in our class as long as we're not, being terrible at it. In K through 12, there's very little academic freedom. You have your standards that you need to teach. You have your evidence-based teaching practices that you need to follow. And a lot of instruction at K through 12 is what we consider blended now. And so shifting that sort of focus, and I think one of the benefits of the books as a guide for practitioners who aren't in that K through 12 setting, who aren't in a college of education, is that it's written for people who don't necessarily know anything about this world, who the only thing they know about teaching is from their mentors and how they were taught. And so, once you get to college, I've heard it both ways when I've written papers and sent them out for review. There's the education people who say you're putting up this straw dog of lecture-based classroom where that's the only thing you do and the homework is the homework, but other than that, there's no activities. I'm like, no, I've seen it. I see it a lot. Even in like a college of education where it's a lot easier in some ways to follow that model that you've always followed. So even if you do research on education, sometimes that doesn't quite make it into your actual practices. So I think that's one of the benefits of the book, and what we tried to do is to make it easier to make that switch over to blended learning, because a lot of students are a little struck when they get to higher education and they're lectured at for a lot of the time. So yeah, I think continuing that trend that's been in K through 12 is a real value.
So I have the same reaction. I think of blended learning. used to be you had to decide you wanted color television. Now it's just television. You want to do that. And so, my experience in back then was the same, where this is just learning. But I agree that particularly in higher ed, you do see less of an adoption of what we would think of as best practice in learning. So 2 questions for any of you. Why is that? And then how do you go about infusing these better practices into a higher education setting?
You want to talk about?
I'll give you my answer, and you all may have your own answer as well. I think one of the there's some real institutional resistance to changing from the old lecture format and the sage on the stage kind of format. It's not even necessarily that people think that the lecture is right, although there are many who believe that that is the case. You should lecture. That's what college professors do. But even for those who think that they would like to do something else, that they might like to try blended learning, there's a lot of institutional resistance in terms of the time that it takes, the willingness to take a risk in teaching a course in a different way. One of the things that we talk about in the book is that institutions can step up to provide more support. For example, providing some release time for an instructor to have a semester to take the time, as David was saying, to invest that time up front in creating the materials that are going to be needed for the course. How we change that, I think, has to really come from having a larger conversation around what's the purpose of being in higher education at all anymore. The purpose I think the purpose has become over time for credentialing. You come here, you sit in a lecture hall, you take your exams, and eventually you get a piece of paper that says that you're eligible to go out and get this job. But if we really want to look at higher education in terms of the purpose is to learn, the purpose is to become a better worker, a better person, a better contributor to society, however you want to look at it, then we have to say what are going to be the most effective ways that we can teach students to learn. That we can give them that opportunity for learning. That's a tougher, maybe more meta conversation up at the top that we need to have, but I think that's one of the things that's making it more difficult to adapt. Say something.
Let me add just a little bit to what Robert said. When we started working on the book, we were thinking about practitioners, teachers. In the middle, we started thinking about researchers. But towards the end of the book, we realized that we were addressing administrators as much as teachers and researchers. And the way we were addressing administrators, the target of this book was in 2 ways. One was incentives, and the other was culture. And I think the last chapter covers both of them. So part of the reason why OMSCS succeeded at Georgia Tech is because faculty were provided strong incentives to succeed. And I think a major thing that C21U is doing is trying to change the culture at Georgia Tech. And I think those are the 2 combinations that we need, incentives and culture, for this to work. Whenever that has worked, those 2 things have been there, and I think that's where we need to emphasize, focus, invest.
And I'll just add one quick thing is I see the biggest barrier that I see for people implementing blended learning is that they have to give up control of what's happening in their classroom. If they've prepared exactly what they're going to say and how they're going to say it and when they're going to take questions and probably what those questions will be, it's very uncomfortable to think, well, I'm going to assign these students this activity and then I'm going to see what happens. And sort of think on the fly. And so the thing that I tell people when they're asking me, how do I do blended learning is it's fine to not have control. I've never had someone come back and say, oh, that was a mistake. I hated that. It's terrible. They've always found it sort of invigorating and exciting. They have to re-recognize that they are the expert in this space and they can answer the questions that students are going to have, or that it's okay to say, that's a really good question, that's an advanced question, I don't know exactly. But it's also okay to not get it right the first time. Like any new class, it's going to take 1, 2, maybe 3 times to get like you really know what you're thinking. So if you can get the incentive to get people to try it, even for maybe a class or 2, I find that that's often a big hurdle that they have to overcome.
Can I add one more thing? There's a chapter in the book that Don Webster is the first author on. He's a professor in the College of Engineering that I and Amanda Madden co-wrote on the chapter with him. And Don and I were looking at surveys that he had administered to his students, in addition to the regular CO surveys that the college does, or that the Institute does. Don had given them a simple paper survey to ask them about what they thought of the blended classroom model in his fluid dynamics class. And we were looking together at some of the comments that students had left on that survey. And the reason that I bring this up is because there's a little bit of student resistance to this as well. One of the comments on the surveys was that this student said, I hate the video lectures. If I wanted to watch video lectures, I would have gone to the University of Phoenix. And so there's sort of this expectation, I think, for at least one segment of students, of the student population, that any professor who's delivering their lecture materials through technology is cheating, that they really should be standing up on the stage and giving me that lecture, and that if you're recording your lectures, you're just trying to get away with something. So there's a little bit of that resistance as well.
Any final questions, comments about anything?
I guess I'm finding myself. Point. Look, I view the university like a symphony orchestra. Not everybody plays tuba, okay? And there are some people on the faculty that should not play with blended learning. It's like teaching pigs to sing. It's not going to produce any music, and it clearly annoys the pig. On the other hand, there are some students who come to us with a view of getting out. And what they really want is not the lecture. What they really want is the degree. And they have a view that this is contractual, and they have signed up to do this. This is exactly what they ought to do. They shouldn't have to do anything more than that. And so that format's not going to work for them either, where it's unstructured or less structured in a different way. One of the things that I started very early is I have a permit-only class, and they have to apply. And I have 3 questions. And the last one is, are you prepared to put up with the class, which is going to take more work, and the goalposts are going to keep moving? So that there is an implicit buy-in with the fact that this is going to be different. And we get past the student resistance. But you have to find the right topic, and you've got to match it with your learning objectives, which is not just necessarily the subject matter objectives. But I think your point is well taken.
Thank you. So I have 2 pieces of advice when I talk to faculty who want to blend. First is that it's okay to give up control and that it's more fun than you think it's going to be. Then the second one is towards this point of the student resistance, because students, especially I found being at Georgia State now, Georgia Tech students in particular have figured out how to game the system. They know exactly what they need to do. They've learned it over the past 16 years of how to do the least amount of work to get the most amount of grade. So what I started doing, and when I was first teaching, CETL helped me to sort of think about how you set up the first day of class. And so what I started doing first day of class for a non-lecture class is saying, this is how you succeed in the class. And the students have much less resistance when they have a plan for how to succeed in the class, because they come in with their own idea of how they're going to succeed in the class, and that's not going to work in this case. So I tell them how to succeed in the class, and then we're just really consistent with that throughout the semester. And every time a student asks a question of, well, I didn't do this, or I don't understand the activity, or what's the point of this, I go back to the learning objectives. I said, this is what I want you to get out of this class. you seem to agree that that's a good learning objective at the beginning of the class, so this is how we're going to achieve that goal. And that it took a bit of practice to answer questions on the fly with how is this contributing to the learning objectives of the class. But once you can sort of get into an automatic response like that, it becomes very easy to know what the correct answer is.
Rich?
Well, can I just say congratulations to you guys and virtually. I know the amount of effort that it took to produce this book, and how much you guys are invested in it. It shows in the book. We're going to be making this a centerpiece for people that visit C21U, so you'll see some sales as a result of that. The question of how we make this a project, how we keep it a living book, I think is a really interesting one. So we may come back to you for some ideas, and let's think about how we keep this updated and a vital part of the center going forward. Congratulations once again.
As a co-author, thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's give a round of applause to all the